Welcome to the Health Headliner podcast by Tudu Digital. Our content is informational only and not medical advice. Please consult your provider. Now, let's dive into today's headlines.
It's wild to think about, but it seems like cannabis is almost everywhere these days.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
Almost half of all adults in the U.S. have tried it at least once. And we all know those kind of in-the-moment effects, right? Like the stuff you feel right away.
Right.
But it makes you wonder about the subtler long-term changes that might be happening beneath the surface.
Yeah.
Like, could cannabis be tweaking things at a really deep level in our bodies?
Yeah.
Maybe even messing with our molecules.
Well, that's a fascinating question.
Yeah.
And it's something that researchers are really starting to dig into.
Right.
There's some brand new research that's shedding some light on these mysteries, and it's pretty interesting stuff.
So we're diving into all that today.
Yeah, we are.
Taking a close look at this research.
Absolutely.
To see what it might reveal about the long-term effects of cannabis.
All right, sounds good.
So maybe we can start with what makes this research so interesting.
Well, one of the things that makes this research so compelling is that it's exploring a potential connection between cannabis use and what we call epigenetic changes.
Okay, epigenetic changes. Now, that sounds complicated.
It might sound a bit intimidating, but it's actually a pretty straightforward concept.
Okay.
Think of your DNA as like the instruction manual for your body.
Okay, got it.
It contains all the information that determines how your body works.
Makes sense.
Now, epigenetics is like a set of switches that sit on top of those instructions.
Oh, I see.
These switches don't change the instructions themselves,
Okay.
but they can control which genes are turned on or off.
So they're kind of like the volume knobs for your genes?
Exactly. They can amplify certain genes or mute others.
Wow, that's pretty powerful stuff. And this research is looking at how cannabis might be affecting those volume knobs, right?
Precisely. It's suggesting that cannabis use could be flipping some of those epigenetic switches, which in turn could have a significant impact on how our bodies function over the long haul.
And this isn't just a small study, is it? I mean, how many people were involved in this research?
It's actually a pretty substantial study.
Okay.
They looked at data from over 1,000 adults.
Wow, that's a lot of people.
And they tracked their cannabis use and some specific biological markers over a long period of time.
So this is a long-term study then?
Exactly. They wanted to see how things changed over time.
Right.
And the results were published in Molecular Psychiatry, which is a pretty well-respected journal in the field.
Okay, so we've got cutting-edge research, a large sample size, and long-term data. This is some serious stuff.
Yeah, it's definitely worth paying attention to.
So with this deep dive, we want to really break this down so people can understand what these findings mean.
Absolutely.
Without getting bogged down in all the scientific jargon.
Exactly. We want to make this accessible to everyone.
Right. So let's dive into the study itself.
Okay, sounds good.
What were the researchers trying to figure out with this particular research?
So the main thing they were trying to do was figure out if there's a link between using cannabis and something called DNA methylation.
DNA methylation. Okay, break that down for me.
Sure.
What exactly is that?
So DNA methylation is a type of epigenetic modification. It's like adding or removing little tags on our DNA.
Tags. Okay, what do these tags do?
These tags, they're called methyl groups, and they can affect how easily our cells can read the instructions in our DNA.
So it's like putting a sticky note on a page. It might make it harder to read that part.
That's a great analogy.
Right.
It's like a little flag that says, hey, pay attention to this part, or maybe skip over this section.
Okay, I'm starting to get it.
Yeah, so this DNA methylation is a key way that our body controls which genes are active and which ones are quiet.
Interesting. So how did they go about doing this research? How did they collect the data?
Well, they tapped into this really amazing long-term study called the Coronary Artery Risk Development in Young Adults Study.
Wow, that's a mouthful.
Yeah, it's a bit of a tongue twister, but we'll just call it the Cardia study.
Okay, the Cardia study.
This study is incredible. It's been going on for over 20 years.
Wow, over 20 years.
And they started with people who were 18 to 30 years old back then.
So they've really been following these people for a long time.
Yeah, they've got data on these folks for their entire adult lives.
Wait.
And for this cannabis research, they focused specifically on data collected at the 15-year mark and the 20-year mark.
So they followed up with these people after 15 years and again after 20 years.
Exactly. They wanted to see how things were changing over time.
And they took blood samples at those checkups, right?
Yeah, they did.
To see what was going on at a molecular level.
You got it?
What exactly were they looking for in those blood samples?
So In those samples, they were specifically looking at the DNA and methylation levels,
Okay.
and they used this super sophisticated technology called the Illumina methylation epic bead chip.
The aluminum methylation epic bead chip. That sounds intense.
It's basically a tool that allows scientists to look at methylation patterns across a huge chunk of our DNA all at once.
Wow, so they can really get a big picture view of what's going on.
Yeah, they can see which genes are being affected and how those methylation patterns are changing over time.
Okay, so they've got these blood samples. They're looking at DNA methylation.
Yeah.
But how did they measure the cannabis use over those 20 years?
Ah, that's a good question.
Yeah, I mean, people's habits can change so much over time, right?
Yeah.
Like, someone might be a heavy user for a few years and then quit completely, or vice versa. So how do they account for that?
They were really smart about it. They used detailed questionnaires at multiple points throughout those 20 years.
Okay, so they checked in with these people regularly about their cannabis use.
Exactly.
Right.
And this allowed them to get a good picture of not just recent use, meaning in the 30 days before the blood sample, but also their total cannabis use over time.
So they were looking at both short-term and long-term cannabis use.
Yeah, and to really quantify the long-term use, they came up with this measure called marijuana years.
Marijuana years, what's that, like dog years, but for cannabis?
It's a bit like that, kind of a way to compare different patterns of use.
Okay.
So one marijuana year is the equivalent of smoking cannabis every day for a year.
Okay, got it.
And they calculated this for each person based on their responses to those questionnaires.
So if someone smoked every day for 5 years, that'd be 5 marijuana years.
Exactly.
Interesting. And they factored in other things that could affect DNA methylation too, right?
Yes, they did.
Like it's not just cannabis that can impact these epigenetic markers.
Right. There are lots of other things that can influence DNA methylation.
Like what?
Things like age, sex, race, tobacco use, how active someone is, and how much alcohol they drink.
So they took all of that into account to really isolate the potential effects of cannabis.
Exactly. They wanted to make sure they were seeing the specific impact of cannabis on DNA methylation.
Okay, so after all that data collection and analysis, what did they find?
Well, they found a number of DNA methylation markers that were linked to cannabis use.
Okay, so there was a clear connection there.
Yeah, but here's the interesting part. The number of markers they found was different depending on whether they were looking at recent use or total use over time. And it also varied between the 15-year and 20-year marks.
Okay, so it wasn't a simple cannabis equals these specific changes kind of finding.
Right. It was more nuanced than that.
Can you give me some specifics?
Sure. At the 15-year mark, they found 22 methylation markers associated with recent use and 31 associated with cumulative use.
Okay, so more markers linked to long-term use at that point.
Yeah, but then at the 20-year mark, they found 132 markers associated with recent use.
Yeah, that's a big jump.
And only 16 with cumulative use.
So it seems like the relationship between cannabis use and these epigenetic markers is pretty complex.
Yeah, it definitely seems that way.
Was there any marker that stood out, though?
Actually, there was one marker that was consistently associated with both recent and cumulative use at both time points.
Oh, interesting. Which one was that?
It was a marker in a gene called AHRR.
Okay, and why is that marker so important?
Well, this same marker has also been linked to tobacco use in previous studies.
So it might not be cannabis itself that's causing this change, but the act of smoking.
Yeah, that's a possibility.
So inhaling smoke, whether it's from cannabis or tobacco, could be triggering some similar epigenetic changes.
Exactly. It's a really interesting finding that suggests there might be a common pathway there.
Okay, so that's the AHR gene. What about other genes? Did they find any other connections?
Yeah, they found some links to other genes, but those associations were more variable depending on the time point and whether they were looking at recent or cumulative use.
Can you give me some examples?
Sure. Some of the genes that popped up were MYO5C, SCN11A, NOX4, BMF, and a whole bunch more.
Those are some serious-sounding genes. What do they do?
They're involved in all sorts of important processes in the body.
Like what?
Things like immune response, how nerve cells communicate with each other, and how cells grow and divide.
Okay, so we're talking about some pretty fundamental processes here.
Yeah, these are processes that are essential for maintaining our health.
So if cannabis is affecting these genes, what could the long-term health implications be?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's something that researchers are still trying to figure out.
But it's something we should be concerned about, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if cannabis is altering how our genes work, that could have serious consequences down the line.
Yeah, it's definitely something to pay attention to.
I mean, some of those genes you mentioned have been linked to pretty serious conditions, haven't they?
Yeah, some of those genes have been implicated in things like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and substance use disorders in other studies.
Plus, there's a potential for some pretty serious health risks here.
It's definitely a possibility, and it underscores the need for more research in this area.
Yeah, we need to understand these connections better.
Absolutely. And this study also highlights the importance of considering the long-term effects of cannabis use.
Right, it's not just about the immediate high. There could be lasting changes happening at a molecular level.
Exactly. And the fact that some of those methylation markers were dynamic, meaning they changed over that 5-year period between measurements, suggests that even shorter-term use could be having an impact.
So it's not just long-term, heavy users who need to be concerned about this.
It seems like even occasional use could be leaving its mark on our epigenome.
Wow, that's pretty eye-opening. But it's important to remember that this is just one study, right?
Right. And like all research, it has its limitations.
So what are some of the things we need to keep in mind when we're interpreting these findings?
Well, the most important thing to remember is that this study shows an association. It doesn't prove causation.
What does that mean?
It means that we can't say for sure that cannabis use is causing these changes in DNA methylation.
Oh, okay.
It could be that there are other factors at play that are influencing both cannabis use and those epigenetic markers.
I see. So it's a correlation, not necessarily a direct cause and effect relationship. And what about how they gathered information about cannabis use?
Ah, yes. That's another important limitation to consider.
I mean, people might not be totally honest about their cannabis use, right? Especially considering the legal status has been a bit of a moving target over the past 20 years.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
So there could be some underreporting there.
It's definitely a possibility. And another thing to note is that they didn't look at different methods of cannabis use separately.
What do you mean?
Well, they didn't distinguish between smoking, edibles, vaping, or other ways of using cannabis.
So we don't know if different methods of use might have different effects on DNA methylation.
Exactly. That's something that future research could explore.
Okay, and what about the people who participated in this study? Was it a diverse group?
The study mainly included Black and white adults from 4 places in the U.S.
Okay, so it wasn't the most diverse sample.
Right. And that's another limitation to keep in mind.
So we need more research and more diverse populations to see if these findings hold up across different groups of people. Okay, it's always good to hear what the experts have to say about this kind of research.
Yeah, absolutely.
Did they include any quotes from the researchers in the article?
Yeah, they did.
What did they have to say?
Well, one of the epidemiologists, Lifeng Hao from Northwestern University, emphasized that they observed associations between cumulative marijuana use and multiple epigenetic markers over time.
Observed associations. I like how they're being cautious with their language.
Right. They're not overstating their findings.
Yeah, they're acknowledging that they found a link, but they're not saying for sure that one thing caused the other.
Exactly.
And what about the other epidemiologists?
Drew Nannini, also from Northwestern, said that the research provided novel insights into the association between marijuana use and epigenetic factors.
Novel insights, that's a good way to put it. This research is opening up new avenues of exploration.
Right, it's shedding light on an area that we're just starting to understand.
But he also stressed that more research is needed, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. He emphasized that we need to confirm these findings in different populations.
Okay.
And we also need to figure out the link between these epigenetic changes and what happens to our health as we get older.
So this is really just the beginning.
Yeah, it's an important first step, but there's still a lot we don't know.
And that's science, right? It's a process of constantly refining our understanding.
Exactly.
So as we wrap things up here, what's the biggest takeaway from all of this?
I think the key message is that cannabis use is associated with changes in DNA methylation.
Okay.
And these changes could potentially affect our long-term health by influencing how our genes function.
And it really reinforces the idea that our epigenome isn't set in stone, right?
Right.
It's constantly being shaped by our environment and our lifestyle choices.
Exactly. It's a dynamic system that's responsive to the things we do and the things we're exposed to.
It's like our epigenome is this ongoing conversation between our genes and our environment.
That's a great way to put it.
And cannabis use seems to be part of that conversation.
It certainly seems that way.
And it makes you think, doesn't it?
About what?
If something like cannabis can have these subtle but potentially significant effects on our epigenome, what other everyday things might be doing the same?
Yeah, that's a really good question.
Like, are we constantly reshaping our epigenome without even realizing it? And what could the consequences of those changes be, not just for us, but for future generations?
It's definitely something to ponder.
Yeah, food for thought. Thanks for taking this deep dive with me.
My pleasure. It's always fascinating to explore these cutting-edge topics.
I agree. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing.
Thanks for tuning in to the Health Headliner podcast by To Digital. Like and subscribe for more health news and breakthroughs. Stay healthy and informed. See you next time.